Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I'm a customer engineer focused on management technologies. Today's discussion is part 3 of an ongoing series focused on configuration profiles in Intune, which of course is part of Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Today's session will be focused on iOS and iPad and also Mac. And really, this session is an introduction, so we're not going to dive deeply into the topics really here at all. I want to introduce the topics, and then we'll dive deeper into them in future sessions. So we had our discussion on Windows in part 2. We will do our discussion on Android in part 4, also in an overview session, and then we will start diving deeply with part 5, which will start to look at certificates and so on, how you get those deployed. But we'll save that for then, right? Okay, so part 3, introduction. So here's our agenda as we go through. We want to talk about configuration profiles, what they are, why we care, kind of walk through some of the requirements, show how it works in a couple of scenarios, and then dive into the console to briefly give an overview of a few things. Configuration profiles are a very interesting topic, kind of a tangent here. Of all of the capabilities of Intune, configuration profiles is probably one of the top 2 or 3 areas where people will first start working with Intune and find value. Now, if you just use Intune, then still configuration profiles is going to be that section where you will find a tremendous amount of value to be able to configure your environment, the settings you need, your devices the way that you want, and so on. So there is a tremendous amount of detail here that is very much something that you want to look at if you're new to Intune and understand what's here, right? So let's dive into it. So what are these things called configuration profiles? Well, really, if you boil it all down, this is a grouping of settings and configurations that you would want to apply to your device. So in this section, this is an iOS discussion or an Apple discussion today. But if you think about the Windows world, where historically PCs are domain joined and configurations and so on are deployed through group policy. Well, in the modern world, where we're not really going to have devices, or at least the goal is not to have devices joined to on-prem AD any longer, you're going to have to find an alternate way to deploy the same settings. Well, that alternate pathway is configuration profiles in Intune. That's one major way, right? Same thing applies here. I gave that illustration to just give an analogy, but same kind of thing. This is applying settings and configurations and restrictions and behavioral changes and all of those different options that you would want to apply to a corporate environment. This is where you would go about doing that, right? So why do we care about configuration profiles? Because we live in a world now where mobile devices, modern management, all of those aspects are really, really important. Azure AD certainly is an indicator of that, a symbol of that, right? Devices that are participating in Azure AD can be managed by Intune and uh, by the administrators in the enterprise, right? So a really, really important thing. Also, because our configuration profiles are very robust, right? A huge, vast array of configuration options. Actually, options even beyond the UI. So a little bit of a tangent here. Especially in the early days of Intune, but even still today, some folks will go into the console looking for a particular setting. They will not find it maybe and walk away thinking, well, I guess Intune can't manage my devices because I need to manage this setting. Well, wait on that thought, right? Because there's 2 different pathways to providing management or configuration of management options for your devices, specifically in the configuration profiles arena. One is the options that are presented in the UI. And certainly if the options are present in the UI, it's going to be a more straightforward path and recommended to use the UI to deploy those settings. But Just because something may not be in the UI does not mean that you can't configure it and manage it through Intune. The biggest question is whether the OS that you're trying to manage, one of the Apple OSs, one of the Google OSs, or Microsoft, whether the core operating system supports the setting that you want to use to apply configurations to the device. If the core OS supports those settings that you want to configure, then certainly, almost certainly through Intune, you can configure and manage those things. The choice is whether you use the native UI or whether you use the UI to implement what's called a custom setting, which I'll show you in this session a little bit, and probably in this series, we will have a session focused solely on custom configurations because it's such an important capability to understand your options, right? And then what you're going to find also is the configurations that you have in the console are going to be very focused, very easy to navigate. Depending on where you joined us in the Intune journey, that wasn't always the case, especially in the early days. Been a long time ago now, thankfully. But in the early days, it was very easy to get confused in the UI as to what setting applied to what device type and what you were configuring and so on. Now it's very organized, very easy to know that you're configuring a setting properly for a given device that you care about, right? So very focused by platform, by the configuration that you want to deploy. There's even some things for Mac OS and Windows. So whenever I did the Windows session, this wasn't available then, right? There's a little bit of a pause between when I did part 2 and now I'm doing part 3. And so as things happen, there were some changes introduced to make things a little bit easier to navigate that apply, at least at the time of this recording, to Windows and Mac OS. So you'll see the Mac OS version in this session and know that it also applies to Windows, right? Okay, so what are the requirements for this in order for you to configure and get this going with configuration profiles? Well, certainly Intune is a requirement because your device does need to have a management platform. Azure AD is a requirement. Let me explain that one. So Azure AD is where your devices will be present, right? In the Windows world, we have the option of joining Azure AD or registering in Azure AD. That's not the same option for any other device type, right? With an Apple device, you don't have really the concept of joining Azure AD per se. You don't with Google either, but you do have the option to register your device in Azure AD, which is really required for the device to be Intune managed, which that kind of goes along with the next one, that your device, in order to participate in receiving policy related to configuration profiles, it does need to be enrolled in Intune. Why do I call that out? It almost seems inferred, right? There are certain configurations specifically on the iOS platform and Android platform, true also on the Windows platform, just a little bit of a different pathway to get there. There are configurations where you can actually manage applications on the device without the device actually being enrolled in management through Intune. That's called Microsoft Application Management or App Protection Policies these days. Um, and those you can implement whether the device is enrolled or not. It just requires that the application be configured in such a way that it can receive these policies. I go through that. That's all I'll say about it. I go through that in detail in the client app series that's out there. But want to call out specifically that to receive these configuration profile settings, the device does in fact need to be enrolled. So how does this work, right? Two things I want to hit on here real quick. First, in general, how does it work for you to configure something in the Intune console? The Endpoint Manager Admin Center, right? Intune is part of that, so I will still probably call it Intune Console, but know that I mean the Endpoint Manager Admin Center. How does it work to configure something in the Intune console and get that configuration all the way through to the device in a timely way, right? That's the key phrase, in a timely way. I call this out because if you look at our documentation, we will talk about that configurations will go down to the device, and configurations will be prepared, and the device will check in on a schedule to pull down its configurations. So depending on the device, it can vary a little bit, but you can expect that to be every 6 to 8-ish hours, and certainly more frequently at the beginning. So that is whenever someone reads that, and they're coming from a configuration manager or a traditional management platform like configuration manager background, they think of the way configuration manager will pull policy on a schedule so that the device will come by default every hour and pull policy, and think, wow, we get an hour, every hour to check in with configuration manager, but on the Intune side, we have to wait and only check in about every 6 to 8 hours, depending on the device. That seems really strange. Why do we have such a long gap? And that's where a discussion like this is relevant, because in the MDM world, the way this all stitches together and works together is different than in configuration manager. In fact, configuration manager, if you look at it, is becoming uh, more aligned with the speed of getting configurations to devices that Intune is. I will not go down that tangent because we're talking here. But so here's what happens. When you, as the Intune administrator, create a configuration profile, or really most anything, there are some exceptions, but vast majority of things that you would create in the Intune console and assign to a device, what would happen is, since we know that the configuration is assigned to a device, right, then that device needs to implement it. So what's going to happen is Intune will assess, okay, you've assigned it to this group of devices. In this group of devices, what do I have? Do I have just Apple devices? Do I have a mix of Apple and Google? How do I split it up? And Intune figures out which devices should actually be targeted by the configuration that you've implemented. And it will then reach over to what's called the notification service. And that notification service will be asked to tell the devices to check in. Right now, let's pause there for a minute. When I say notification service, what do I mean? Every platform, whether it's Windows or Apple or Google, has its own notification service. For Windows, that's called the Windows Notification Service. For Apple, it's the Apple Push Notification Service. For Google, that's I believe it's Google Play. It's been a while since I've looked at that, but I believe it's Google Play. Right? And what happens is these services maintain a persistent connection to their devices. And so Intune is able to take advantage of that. So when there's a configuration, Intune will ask the notification service, in this case, the Apple Push Notification Service, hey, there's some things pending for these devices, and it will provide a list of devices. Can you go tell those devices to check in? And so the Apple Push Notification Service, in this case, will go down and tell the Apple devices, hey, there's something waiting for you. You need to check in right away. And those devices will then check in right away. This is why whenever you put a configuration together and deploy it or assign it to devices in your lab or in production or whatever, very, very likely you will see that configuration go down to those devices within minutes, right? Now, so what is the role of the cycle that the device maintains to check in with the MDM service, in this case Intune? That is really a fail-safe, right? So if somehow the connection to these notification services is broken, and that can happen, it's rare. I haven't frankly seen it in the entire time I've been doing support for Intune, but it can happen, right? If that's broken, then this will be a failsafe for those devices to check back in with the service and get current configurations and so on, right? And this is one path, so there's other paths as well. They use the notification service the same way, like if the admin goes into the console and triggers a device to check in from the console, uses the same kind of pathway. So this is really how it works. All right. Now, what about on this other side where we have, or the second slide for how it works? We talked about custom configurations, right? I'll show you custom configurations in just a minute. But I wanted to call this out graphically as well so that you can see what I'm talking about. So whenever you build these custom configurations, there will be things that you will want to add to the system that that may not be in the console, may be in the console, may be some reason you're doing the custom configuration. So you will need to define what those custom configuration settings are and then export them to a file that can then be imported into Intune, into the custom profile section, and exported to your devices, or sorry, assigned to your devices. So the way it works is you're either going to have Apple Configurator or Apple Profile Manager. Those are the two tools from Apple that will allow you to build the custom settings that you need. And then through those tools, there's also some third-party tools. I actually have a third-party tool that I use to quickly create my sample custom configuration profiles. I'm not going to go into what those are. You can pick the third party or the tool of choice, whether it's from Apple, third party, whichever you choose. But you're going to export those. Build your configuration, export them into a file that you can then bring into Intune, assign that to the devices, and the devices will take those settings accordingly. Again, you'll see that in just a minute. So, all right. So now that that's done, let's actually walk through this thing and see what some of the options are. So to do that, I'm going to pull in the Endpoint Manager console, or as I also call it, the Intune console. And this, again, we're not going deep. This is an introduction, really is all it is. So I'm going to go look at devices. So I mentioned that Intune allows you to really focus in on what you care about. So if I go to devices, I'm going to be able to see the options for all of the devices. I can look at all devices here, right? I'll see all devices, and I'll see all of the OSs, Windows, Apple, Google, makes no difference, right? And I can also go down and I can look at configuration profiles. And I can go create a configuration profile. Well, in this view, this top level view, I would have to specify what operating system I care about. Again, not hard to do. You can absolutely do that, no issue. But and this by itself will help you stay focused, because the only settings then that will appear here are going to be those that are associated with iOS or iPadOS. Or the other thing you can do is just even be more focused than this and specify that the devices that you want to see are only iOS and iPadOS. That's all you'll see. And then when you go to configuration profiles and ask to create one, the only options you're going to get are going to be for iOS and iPadOS. And so if I look at these options, these are the ones that will be useful for configuring various things on the iPad or iPhone. And so here's custom. You'll see that in a minute. I'm not going to go through these again. This is an overview session, so I'm not diving deeply into any of these. I will dive deeply into several of them as we go along. But here is just to give you a sense of how these things stitch together. Here's device restrictions. I'll show you that in a minute. Here's device features. I'll show you that in a minute. Here's email. We'll probably dig into that one. Here's certificate stuff. This is part 5 of this series that, honestly, in the order of recording this, I recorded part 5 before I ever even did part 1. So it's out there. It's been out there for a little bit. And I cover certificates there. We'll probably hit VPN and Wi-Fi as well in separate sessions, right? But these are the options that you can use to configure things, right? And then on the Mac OS side, you have some similar things, but again, Mac OS is not an iPhone, it's not an iPad, it's different. So if I look at configuration profiles, then the options that I'm going to have are going to be different in a couple of ways. First, notice that I don't have the settings categories like I just showed you for iOS and iPad. That's because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this session, we have introduced what are called the settings catalog and also templates, with the intention of helping you have a little bit more ease, if you will, toward configuring settings. Now, the settings that you can configure are exactly the same. There's no difference. It's just a different way, an easier way, at least that's the hope, of getting to those settings, to be able to configure those settings collectively in some ways, make sure you're not missing anything, and so on, right? So again, in the Windows session, I did not show this because it wasn't available at the time. It is available in Windows as well as of this recording, but just applies to Windows and Mac OS at this stage. So let's look at settings catalog. So if I look at settings catalog, I can go create a new group of settings. So I'll just call this demo, right? And so when I click next, then I get the option to add settings from the settings catalog. And so these are going to be various categories of settings that I can add from this catalog. So I might want to add this one. I may want to let's select all these and add them. Right. Then I might want to add from here, select all these and add them. Then I might want to go here and select all these, and if the system will keep up with me, there we go. Select all these, right? And so whenever I get done selecting what I need, I can just back out of it, and then all of the settings that I've chosen that I want to configure are right here. So the idea is in the settings catalog, we're going to show you everything, make sure you're not missing anything, and then from there you choose which ones you want, and we'll present them to you in a grouping here, and then you configure them as you need to, assign them as you need to, as a unit instead of having to do it all individually. Right? That's the approach here. Now, in terms of the templates, uh, they also help you by grouping some things. They'll show you straight up front, right? You saw the drop down when I did iOS and or iPad and iPhone, how you saw all of these options. Well, now you see them here as well. This is just a different way for you to get to this same drop down of configuration. So on the Mac OS, you can have a custom provider. You can do device restrictions. You can do device features, extensions, certificates, and so on. It's just now that we've introduced templates and settings catalog, to get to the specific settings here, you will want to go to templates, choose what you want, and then go configure. So if I want to do device restrictions, I'll just go create a profile based on that. And off we go. I have those settings that I can do. Very akin, very much like what you have with iOS and iPadOS, just a different section you have to click on, right? Okay, so that's as far as I'm going to take this, right? I'm going to jump ahead. So that's just kind of an overview. I do want to show you a few settings that I actually created so that you can see some in action. So we're on macOS. Let me go back to my iOS devices and my configuration profiles here, right? So I have a few. So the first, I have a custom profile. This is where I would build my configuration the way I want and export it from one of either Apple Configurator, Apple Profile Manager, a third-party tool, whatever. I would export it into a file that I would then be able to import into Intune and deploy. So that whole process for getting that file, I'm not going to go through here, but I will show you under configuration settings, I can click edit, and you need to name it. You need to browse for your file that you want to bring in. And so if I browse for it, notice it's going to be a mobile config file, right? And if I look on my desktop, you'll see that I have two mobile config files, one for iOS, one for macOS that I created and exported, right? And it's basically an XML format that will show you the settings that you can have the option to configure, how they're configured, and so on. Once you get done, you can review and save it and assign it, right? So that's custom, using the custom configuration option. Again, we'll probably talk about that more in a unique dedicated session, but that's using it. And then staying with iOS and iPadOS for a minute, there's a couple of others that I'll just quickly show you. So device restrictions is one that might be very interesting to many organizations because they want to configure typically how their devices are able to operate and what choices users have whenever they're being used in a corporate environment. So I will go down to, I will go up to configuration settings here on device restrictions, and you will see a bunch of options here. Right now, I'm not going to walk through every single one of these. There's a couple I've set, like I've set some things under cloud and storage the way I want to, and I've set some things I think it's under general the way I want to. But the point is, there's a tremendous amount of option under here, right? All sorts of things that you can configure the App Store and built-in apps, how they work, and there's even shared shared iPad mode, I think, in here, shared iPad, right, that you can do. And there's a whole bunch of things. So my point in showing you this is it's really easy to click on the category device restrictions, but until you actually see what's in it, you don't realize the vast array of configurations that are possible underneath that big device restrictions umbrella. So definitely take some time and explore, see what your options are. Some options that you may not even know that you want are going to be in here. And then similarly for device features. So if I go back here and look at my configuration for device features, same kind of an idea. Here I'm going to look at the configuration settings and see that it's also got a vast array of things that I might want. Like here's one that I might want lock screen message, and me trying to be a little bit funny here. If this ain't your device, don't use me, right? Or if this ain't you, don't use me. And then also some web content filters where I can specify specific URLs that are permitted, right? Or blocked, right? Whichever I would like to do. So again, highly an overview session, not digging into these. Some of these you may see again, probably will, in later sessions, but a quick overview of what's here. Now, in terms of Mac devices, let's go look at that setup. And I also have custom Mac settings here, right? So let me expand that. So if I look at my Mac settings and look at my properties, then my configuration options, very much the same. Here's an XML piece that I obtained the same way that I did for iOS and iPad. I just simply used one of the tools, configure it, export it, and I brought it into Intune. I can deploy it, right? Okay, so I have some things here under, I picked some things from my template, and I also did it for my settings catalog. So for my settings catalog, I just did a couple of edge settings, I believe is all I did. So if I look at the bottom, I can go to my configuration settings and see what I've actually chosen. Again, not exhaustive. You choose what you want to choose, and then you can put them together the way you want and assign them as a unit under the settings catalog. And then finally, under my Mac OS device, I have the template option that I used. And so here with the template option under properties, I will go to my configuration options here, edit, and see the different choices that I made. Again, I'm not going to go into this in any great detail because it's pretty simple and just trying to give you an overview. All right, so that's really it that I wanted to show you in the session. In terms of troubleshooting tips and tricks, not a ton to do here, really none, because we haven't done anything to assign these to any devices or anything. That's not really the point of this session. It was really to give an overview. But as far as tips and tricks, what I would tell you, if you're new to Intune or you haven't actually spent the time navigating through these sections, I would highly recommend you do, because you'll find some hidden nuggets and gems that you may not even realize are there. And with that, we will end the session here, and we will see you next time.